He thought forcing her onto that stage would be a harmless joke, but in less than a minute, Victor Langford would realize he had just humiliated himself instead. The grand hall of the Ashton Philharmonic glowed under golden chandeliers, every polished surface reflecting wealth, prestige, and power measured in decades of reputation and millions in donations. Rows of velvet seats stretched across the room, filled with elegantly dressed guests who spoke in low, confident tones, the kind of people who were used to being important. And at the center of it all stood Victor Langford, a name that carried weight in every major music institution across the country, a man whose performances sold out concert halls from New York to Los Angeles, a man who believed talent belonged to a certain class of people. Just beyond the spotlight, barely noticed by anyone, Emily Carter moved quietly along the edge of the stage, a soft gray cardigan draped over her shoulders, her worn sneakers making no sound against the polished floor. At 38, she had mastered the art of invisibility, keeping her head down, her movements efficient, her presence forgettable. To the orchestra, she was just the cleaning lady who wiped fingerprints off the piano keys after rehearsals. To the staff, she was someone who didn't quite belong in a place where tickets cost more than most people's weekly rent. But Emily noticed everything. The subtle tension in the violin section, the impatience in the conductor's sigh, the way Victor Langford's fingers hovered just a fraction too long over certain notes during rehearsal, as if savoring his own brilliance. She said nothing, of course. People like her weren't expected to speak in rooms like this. That afternoon, as the final rehearsal wrapped, Victor stepped back from the piano, rolling his shoulders with a slight smirk as polite applause echoed through the hall. His gaze drifted, almost lazily, until it landed on Emily, who had paused near the instrument, her eyes briefly lingering on the keys as she wiped away a faint smudge. There was something about that moment, something about the quiet confidence in her stillness, that irritated him more than he could explain. "Careful," he called out, his voice cutting cleanly through the room, drawing attention like a spotlight snapping on. "That instrument costs more than most people make in a year." A few musicians chuckled softly. Emily froze for a fraction of a second, then nodded and stepped back, her expression calm, unreadable. But Victor wasn't finished. Something in him wanted more, wanted to turn this quiet interruption into entertainment. He gestured toward the bench with a casual flick of his hand. "Actually," he said, louder now, ensuring every ear in the room caught his words, "why don't you play something for us? Let's see what all that curiosity looks like in action." The room shifted. Conversation stopped. A ripple of amusement spread through the audience, subtle at first, then sharper, expectant. All eyes turned to Emily Carter, the quiet woman who had never once been part of the performance. And in that moment, without realizing it, Victor Langford had just set the stage for something he would never be able to control. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected, and in that silence, something shifted. Emily Carter did not move right away. She stood there, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid direct attention, yet steady enough to show she had heard every word. Around her, the musicians exchanged glances, some amused, others curious, a few already anticipating the awkwardness that would follow. Victor Langford leaned casually against the piano, arms crossed, the faintest smile playing at the corner of his mouth, as if he had just arranged a clever piece of entertainment to break the monotony of rehearsal. "Go on," he added, his tone light but edged with something sharper underneath. "It is just a piano. How hard could it be?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room, not loud, but enough. Enough to remind everyone exactly where Emily stood in the unspoken hierarchy of that hall. Emily took a small breath, almost imperceptible, then stepped forward. Her sneakers made a soft sound against the polished floor, each step measured, unhurried, as if she were walking into something she had already accepted long ago. Up close, the piano gleamed under the stage lights, its black surface reflecting fragments of the room, chandeliers above, faces watching, Victor's silhouette standing just behind her. For a brief moment, her hand hovered over the keys, not touching, just hovering, like someone remembering something rather than discovering it. Maybe something simple, one violinist muttered under his breath, barely concealing a smirk. Another leaned closer, whispering, "This will not last 10 seconds." Victor said nothing. Now, he did not need to. The room was already doing the work for him. Emily slowly lowered herself onto the bench. The soft creak of the seat seemed louder than it should have been, amplified by the tension building in the air. She adjusted her posture slightly, straightening her back, her shoulders relaxing in a way that did not match the nervous expectation surrounding her. It was subtle, so subtle most people did not notice it. But a few did. The conductor, standing near the edge of the stage, narrowed his eyes just slightly. Something about the way she sat, not hesitant, not stiff, but composed, deliberate. It did not fit the story everyone had already decided about her. Emily placed her fingers on the keys. This time, she did not hesitate. But she did not play either. Not yet. The pause lingered, stretching just long enough to make the audience shift in their seats, just long enough for Victor's smile to tighten ever so slightly. Because now, the moment was no longer entirely under his control. The room, once filled with quiet amusement, began to hold its breath. And in that fragile, suspended second, before a single note had been played, something unspoken passed through the space, something that made it clear this was no longer a joke. The woman they thought they understood had not said a word, had not defended herself, had not even looked up. But somehow, without doing anything at all, she had already begun to change the atmosphere of the entire room. And then, without warning, her fingers moved. The first note did not explode into the room. It unfolded, soft, controlled, precise, like a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the hall. The sound was clean, unmistakably intentional, not the hesitant touch of someone guessing, but the confident strike of someone who knew exactly where each note belonged. A few people in the audience shifted, their faint smiles lingering, but weaker now, less certain. Emily did not look up. Her eyes remained on the keys, her expression calm, almost distant, as if the room around her had faded into something irrelevant. The second phrase followed, richer this time, layered with a depth that did not belong to a beginner. It carried emotion, not exaggerated, not forced, but controlled in a way that suggested years of discipline, years that no one in that room had ever imagined she possessed. Victor's posture changed almost imperceptibly. His arms, once loosely crossed, dropped slowly to his sides. The faint amusement on his face tightened into something else, something closer to concentration. Because now he was listening. Truly listening. The musicians were the first to feel it fully. A violinist who had been leaning casually against his chair straightened without realizing it. The pianist's phrasing, the timing, the subtle control of dynamics. It was not just correct, it was refined. The kind of refinement that could not be faked, could not be improvised in a moment of luck. It had to be lived. Emily's hands moved across the keyboard with fluid precision, her fingers gliding, pressing, lifting, each motion connected to the next with seamless intention. The melody grew, expanding through the hall, filling the high ceilings and reflecting off the marble surfaces, wrapping itself around the audience in a way that demanded attention. Conversations stopped completely. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The room had shifted into something else entirely. A hush fell, deep and absolute. Victor took a step closer to the piano without realizing it. His eyes narrowed, scanning her hands, searching for something, a mistake, a hesitation, any sign that this was not what it appeared to be. But there was none. Instead, what he saw unsettled him more. Her posture remained relaxed, her shoulders steady, her movements economical, as if she was not performing at all, but simply remembering. And that was when it struck him. This was not new to her. This was not a sudden moment of courage or a lucky attempt. This was familiarity. Mastery. The final passage approached, complex, demanding, the kind of sequence that separated amateurs from professionals. A few musicians held their breath, waiting for the break, the slip that would restore their understanding of the world. It did not come. Emily moved through it effortlessly, her tempo unwavering, her touch precise, every note landing exactly where it belonged. And as the last chord resonated through the hall, lingering just long enough to leave an imprint, she lifted her hands from the keys and let the silence return. But this time, it was not the silence of expectation. It was the silence of realization. And in that silence, Victor Langford understood something he had never anticipated. The woman he had tried to reduce to a joke was not beneath him. She had been far beyond him all along. For a moment, no one moved. The final note still seemed to linger in the air, as if the room itself was unwilling to let it go. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, reality returned. A chair creaked. Someone inhaled sharply. And all at once, the silence became something heavier, something undeniable. Emily Carter did not look up for approval. She did not turn toward the audience. She simply rested her hands in her lap, her posture composed, as if what had just happened required no acknowledgement at all. That, more than anything, unsettled them. Because what she had just done was not a performance-seeking validation. It was a truth revealed without permission. Victor Langford stood frozen beside the piano, his gaze fixed on her, but now there was no trace of amusement left in his expression. Only calculation. Only disbelief. His mind moved quickly, searching for an explanation that would restore the balance he had always trusted. Perhaps she had memorized that piece. Perhaps it was luck. But even as those thoughts formed, they collapsed under the weight of what he had just witnessed. That level of control, that phrasing, that emotional restraint, it was not something that could be copied. It had to be owned. Across the room, the conductor stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor. He had spent decades around world-class musicians, and he recognized something rare when he saw it. He studied Emily carefully, his eyes narrowing not with suspicion, but with recognition. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of authority and filled instead with genuine curiosity. Emily lifted her gaze slightly, meeting his question without hesitation, but she did not rush to answer. For a brief second, it seemed as though she might speak. But then she simply gave a small, polite nod, the kind that acknowledged the question without satisfying it. The room shifted again. The audience, once so certain of its assumptions, now searched for new ones, whispering in low, uncertain tones. A woman in the front row leaned toward her companion, her voice barely audible. That was not beginner level. Another voice followed, sharper, more unsettled. That was not even advanced. That was something else. Victor finally found his voice, though it sounded different. Now, tighter, controlled. "That was a well-rehearsed piece," he said, his words carefully chosen, as if placing them on a scale. Impressive memory. But even as he spoke, the weakness in his explanation was obvious. The conductor did not respond. The musicians did not agree. And Emily did not react at all. She simply stood from the bench, smoothing the front of her cardigan with a quiet, habitual motion, as if preparing to return to the role everyone had assigned her before this moment. But something had changed. The way the room looked at her now was no longer dismissive. It was searching, and for the first time, Victor Langford felt something he had not felt in years. Not anger, not embarrassment, but uncertainty. Because deep down, beneath the pride he had built his life upon, a realization had begun to form, slow and unavoidable. He had not uncovered her limits. He had only glimpsed the surface. And the most dangerous part was not what she had already shown. It was the possibility of what she had not yet revealed. The room did not recover quickly. It could not. What had just unfolded did not fit into any familiar category, and people who had spent their lives defining talent suddenly found themselves without words. Emily Carter took a quiet step back from the piano, her movements returning to the same understated rhythm she had carried before any of this began. But now, every eye followed her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she had taken it without trying. The conductor remained where he stood, his gaze still fixed on her, as if searching through memory, trying to place something that felt just out of reach. He had seen prodigies. He had trained professionals. But there was a difference between skill and something deeper, something that came from years not just of practice, but of understanding. And what she had just shown was not learned in isolation. It had been lived. One of the older violinists slowly lowered his instrument, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to the musician beside him. That phrasing, that control. You do not develop that without performing on real stages. The other nodded, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by something closer to respect. Across the hall, the audience shifted uneasily, their earlier assumptions dissolving one by one. The elegant certainty that had filled the room now felt fragile, as if built on something incomplete. Victor Langford noticed all of it. The way attention had moved away from him. The way authority had quietly transferred without announcement. And he did not like it. not because of jealousy, but because of what it implied. He had built his reputation on being the one who recognized excellence, who defined it, who stood above it. And now, in a matter of moments, that position felt uncertain. He took a step forward, reclaiming space with practiced ease, his voice measured, controlled. "If you have that level of ability," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "then perhaps you would not mind demonstrating something less familiar." The words hung in the air, polite on the surface, but edged with challenge. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about control. The room stilled again, tension returning in a different form. This was no longer a joke. This was a test. Emily paused mid-step. For the first time since she had played, she did not continue walking. Instead, she turned back slowly, her eyes lifting just enough to meet Victor's gaze. There was no defiance there, no arrogance, only calm. The kind of calm that does not come from confidence alone, but from certainty. Victor gestured toward the piano again, his expression composed, but his eyes sharper now. "Something you have not prepared," he added, ensuring there would be no misunderstanding. A few musicians exchanged glances. The conductor said nothing, but his posture shifted slightly, as if he, too, was waiting. Because this moment would answer a different question. Not whether she was talented. That had already been decided. But whether her talent was real, or simply remembered. Emily looked at the piano, then back at Victor, and for a brief second, the faintest hint of something passed across her face. Not hesitation, not fear, something quieter, almost like recognition. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back toward the bench. And as she sat down once more, the room understood something that Victor had not yet fully grasped. He was no longer setting the terms of this moment. He was stepping into hers. The moment she sat down again, the energy in the room shifted from curiosity to anticipation, sharp and focused, like the air just before a storm breaks. Emily Carter adjusted her position with quiet precision, her hands resting lightly above the keys, not touching, not moving, as if she were listening to something no one else could hear. Victor Langford stood just a few feet away now, his posture composed, but his attention fixed entirely on her, searching for the smallest sign of uncertainty, a hesitation, a flaw that would restore the balance he believed had been disrupted. "Whenever you are ready," he said, his voice calm, but edged with expectation. The words echoed softly through the hall, then disappeared into a silence that felt heavier than before. This was no longer a demonstration. This was a line drawn. Emily did not respond. She did not nod. She did not acknowledge him at all. Instead, her fingers lowered to the keys, and this time, there was no pause. The first sequence began without warning, not a recognizable melody, not something rehearsed or remembered, but something entirely new. The notes unfolded in a pattern that felt alive, shifting and evolving with each passing second, complex but controlled, unpredictable yet intentional. It was not just music. It was creation. A murmur almost rose from the audience, but it died before it could form, because what they were hearing demanded silence. Her hands moved with a different energy now, faster, more fluid, weaving through scales and transitions that required not just technical mastery, but instinct. The kind of instinct that could not be taught in any classroom, no matter how prestigious. Victor's expression changed again, more noticeably this time. His eyes narrowed, tracking her movements, trying to anticipate where she would go next, but he could not. There was no pattern he could follow, no structure he could predict, and that unsettled him more than anything that had come before. Because this was not repetition. This was command. The conductor took a slow step forward, his breath held, his mind racing as he listened, not just to the notes, but to the intention behind them. He recognized fragments of influence, hints of classical structure layered beneath something more modern, more expressive, blended seamlessly in a way that should not have worked, yet did. Perfectly. Emily's posture remained steady, her face calm, almost detached, as if the complexity of what she was doing required no effort at all. But the room felt it. The rising tension, the precision, the control. It built gradually, note by note, until the entire hall seemed to lean into the sound, drawn forward by something they could not explain. And then, just as suddenly as it began, she shifted. The tempo slowed. The intensity softened. The music resolved itself with a clarity so clean it felt inevitable, as if there had never been any other way it could end. The final notes settled into the space like a quiet truth, undeniable and complete. Her hands lifted from the keys. The silence that followed was different now. Not stunned, not confused. Certain. Victor Langford did not move. He did not speak. Because in that moment, there was nothing left for him to challenge, nothing left to question. The test he had set had not revealed her limits. It had revealed his own. And for the first time in a long time, he understood exactly where he stood in the presence of someone he could no longer define. No one clapped. Not yet. The silence that followed was too complete, too overwhelming, as if the room itself needed time to understand what it had just witnessed. Emily Carter remained seated for a brief moment, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her breathing steady, untouched by the tension that still gripped everyone else. Then, without drawing attention, she stood. The movement was simple, almost quiet enough to miss, but every eye tracked it. Because now, nothing about her was invisible anymore. The conductor was the first to react. He stepped closer, his usual authority replaced by something far more careful, almost respectful. That was not improvisation, he said slowly, as if testing the words before releasing them. That was composition. Emily met his gaze briefly, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her eyes now, something deeper than before, something that suggested she understood exactly what he meant and chose not to confirm it. Around them, the musicians shifted, no longer observers, but witnesses. A cellist leaned forward, his voice low but clear enough to carry. You do not just play like that. Not without training. Not without a career. The word hung in the air. Career. It changed everything. Because now the question was no longer whether she was talented. It was who she had been before she became this quiet presence in the shadows. Victor Langford exhaled slowly, his composure returning in controlled layers, but it was not the same composure he had carried before. This one was tighter, more deliberate, built to hold something back rather than project confidence outward. He studied her carefully, not as a curiosity anymore, but as someone he needed to understand. You have performed before, he said, not asking, but stating it, his voice measured. Emily did not deny it. She did not confirm it either. She simply tilted her head slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, and that was enough. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, but unmistakable. Recognition was beginning to form, not of her identity, but of her place. And it was no longer where they had assumed it to be. Victor took another step closer, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. Why are you here? He asked. It was a simple question, but it carried weight, because it revealed something he could no longer hide. He was no longer in control of the narrative. Emily glanced toward the piano for a brief second, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the instrument, as if it held something personal, something only she could feel. Then she looked back at him. Because this is where I needed to be, she said softly. The answer was not what anyone expected. It did not explain anything. It only deepened the mystery. The conductor exchanged a glance with one of the violinists, both of them silently reaching the same conclusion. There was a story here, one that had not been told, one that might explain how someone with that level of mastery could disappear into a role so small it went unnoticed. Victor heard it too, and for the first time, he did not try to challenge it, because something had shifted beyond his reach. The room, once centered around his presence, now revolved around her. Not because she demanded it, but because she had revealed something no one could ignore. Emily stepped back from the piano, her posture returning to that same quiet composure, as if the moment had already passed for her. But for everyone else, it had just begun. And as the weight of what they had witnessed settled deeper into the room, one truth became impossible to deny. The woman they had tried to define in seconds had a past none of them had the authority to measure. The question lingered in the air long after she spoke. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it refused to explain. No one pressed her further. They could feel it now, the boundary she had quietly placed between what she chose to show and what she would never offer freely. Emily Carter turned slightly, as if preparing to step away again, but this time, the room would not let her disappear so easily. A voice rose from the front row, hesitant at first, then clearer. Wait. All eyes shifted. An older man stood slowly, his posture careful, but his gaze sharp, the kind of gaze shaped by decades of experience. He took a few steps forward, studying her with growing intensity. "I have seen that technique before," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Not recently. Years ago." The room leaned in again, the silence tightening. Victor Langford did not interrupt. He watched, listening now in a way he had not done before. The man continued, his voice steadier as recognition took hold. "There was a performance in Chicago, about 10 years back. A young pianist who disappeared almost as quickly as she appeared. Critics called it one of the most emotionally controlled performances they had ever heard." A ripple moved through the musicians. The conductor's expression sharpened. "I remember that," he said quietly. "They said she refused interviews. No recordings. No follow-up concerts." The older man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Emily. "They said she walked away." The weight of those words settled into the room, heavier than anything that had come before. Walked away. Not failed. Not forgotten. Chose to leave. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, the implications forming faster now, connecting pieces he had not realized were missing. He looked at Emily differently, not as someone out of place, but as someone who had stepped away from a place he had spent his life trying to reach. "That was you," he said quietly. It was not a question. Emily did not react immediately. She stood there, composed, her expression calm, but something in her stillness shifted, just enough to confirm what no one could yet fully accept. The room held its breath again, but this time, it was not waiting for proof. It was absorbing truth. A young violinist whispered, barely audible, "Why would anyone leave that behind?" Emily's gaze softened slightly, not toward the speaker, but somewhere beyond the room. As if she were looking at something far away, something no one else could see. "Because not everything valuable needs an audience," she said quietly. The words landed with a clarity that cut through every assumption that had filled the room just an hour before. Victor Langford felt it more than anyone, because for the first time, he was not standing above someone lesser. He was standing in front of someone who had already walked a path he was still chasing. And in that realization, something within him shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The hierarchy he had trusted no longer held. The definitions he had relied on no longer applied. Emily Carter stepped back once more, her presence returning to that quiet space at the edge of the stage. But now, no one mistook it for insignificance. It was a choice. And the room, filled with people who had spent their lives seeking recognition, finally understood something they had never truly considered. The greatest power is not in being seen. It is in choosing when not to be. No one spoke after that. The weight of her words settled deeper than any performance could have reached, sinking into the polished floors, the velvet seats, the very air that had once been filled with quiet arrogance and easy assumptions. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the stage again, exactly where she had been before any of this began, but now the distance between her and everyone else felt entirely different. It was no longer the distance of status. It was the distance of understanding. The conductor lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, the kind that is given only when something undeniable has been witnessed. Around him, the musicians followed in subtle ways, small shifts in posture, quiet glances, a collective recognition that what they had just experienced could not be measured by titles or positions. Victor Langford remained where he was, his eyes fixed on the space where she had played, as if the piano itself now held a truth he had spent years overlooking. He opened his mouth once, as if to speak, but no words came. Because for the first time, he understood that anything he said would only diminish what had already been made clear without language. Emily adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan, a simple, habitual gesture, then turned toward the side exit of the stage. No announcement, no final acknowledgement, just a quiet departure. And yet, no one looked away. Every step she took echoed louder than applause ever could, each one carrying a kind of certainty that did not need recognition to exist. As she reached the edge of the curtain, she paused for the briefest moment, not to look back, but simply to stand still, as if allowing the room one final chance to understand what had just unfolded. Then she stepped through and disappeared from view. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with realization, with reflection, with the quiet dismantling of every assumption that had once seemed so solid. A man in the audience slowly began to clap, a single, deliberate sound that broke through the stillness. Then another, and another. The applause grew, not loud or chaotic, but steady, rising with a kind of respect that had not been present before. It was not for a performance. It was for a truth. Victor Langford did not join them immediately. He stood there, listening, absorbing, his expression no longer defined by pride, but by something far more difficult to confront. Perspective. Because in that moment, he saw clearly what he had failed to see before. Not just her talent, but his own limitation in recognizing it. And as the applause continued, filling the hall she had already left behind, one quiet realization settled over everyone present, undeniable and lasting. Greatness does not ask to be seen. It simply reveals itself, and in doing so, it changes the way the world looks at everything that comes after.